In this episode, I talk to Alex Paradies from TapRooT once again. We get into some biases that can impact how we interpret important information, leading to wrong conclusions when it comes to how we deep dive our incidents. It's really good information, and it's important that we understand these biases because as safety pros, we have to be able to, one, not only recognize when they're at play, right? When we're, helping and assisting and conducting our own deep dives, but also it's important to understand these biases so that we can coach others properly on how to get through a deep dive process and be able to recognize these for themselves as well. It's a team effort, as I get into that a little bit as well during this interview. So look, it's great stuff. So get ready to take some notes. Let's get into it. Before we get into today's topic, I have one question for you. Are you still painting your floors for 5S markings, things like that? Don't do that. Head over to mightylinetape.com/podcast, a great partner in safety. They've been with us from the beginning. They have some really good products that are going to get you out of a whole lot of time, material, and maintenance and upkeep. Their floor marking tape is second to none. It takes up easily, doesn't leave a sticky residue. They've got floor tape with beveled edges for forklift traffic, carts, things like that. So it really holds up well to that kind of traffic in your facility. They also can do custom floor signs. If you have a particular logo or a message, they can make that happen. Get a free sample and try it for yourself. Again, head over to mightylinetape.com/podcast. Tell them that we sent you. You will get a free sample to try out in your facility today. Again, mightylinetape.com/podcast. All right, before we get into our conversation with Alex about how biases can impact our deep dives, do you want to ensure you're compliant with OSHA standards? Do you wish there was a way to have a comprehensive safety audit without needing OSHA on-site? That program that OSHA offers, right? There's some risk there. Well, how does a mock audit sound with a comprehensive, detailed report? If that sounds like what you're needing, the folks at Aero Safety can take care of you. Their mock audits include the whole 9 yards. We're talking administrative reviews of all safety training programs, written procedures, policies, and a physical walkthrough of your entire facility. To top it all off, the formal report they provide includes a detailed list of any deficiencies, which, let's face it, we've all got them, right? That includes pictures of those deficiencies, applicable recommended corrective actions to help you get on the road to compliance. If you'd like to discuss how a mock audit could help you improve your overall compliance, but more importantly, protect your workers, contact Aero Safety by visiting their website at aerosafetyus.com or email info@aerosafetyus.com. Be sure to mention you heard it on the Safety Pro podcast and get 25% off your estimate. Again, that's aerosafetyus.com or info@aerosafetyus.com to send an email. All right, we're here once again with our friend of the podcast, Alex Paradies from TapRooT. Do you prefer System Improvements or TapRooT? Or
System Improvements is the company. TapRooT is what we're known for. So
there you go.
I take both. Depends on. Most people would know us by saying TapRooT.
I like it, TapRooT. I love because that's how I was introduced to your organization years ago. It was TapRooT is exactly how it was introduced to me. So I love it. Either way, we'll take it. How you doing?
I'm doing great this morning.
I'm glad that you found time this early Friday morning to visit with us. I love what we're about to get into. I love all this stuff, and I appreciate you keeping me focused because I'm like, I have my squirrel moments. But we're gonna somewhat build on some previous topics we've talked about. It's all sort of in this wheelhouse of how do we improve our incident investigations, our deep dives, root cause analysis, whatever you want to call it. And that is, you're going to help us understand how certain biases lead to errors or mistakes. And, we did a whole episode on human error,
I mean, it can go in so many directions. So we're going to try to stay focused for this episode, and maybe launch us into another episode on another topic. But let's sort of like, let's crack this open a little bit. What are we talking about when we talk about biases leading to errors and mistakes?
Yeah, so to build kind of on what we had talked about, I know you had recently, reposted the situational awareness podcast that we did, and in that I said there's a mental model that people have for situational awareness, and it has perception, which is I was going to receive information and perceive it. Then you had to comprehend that information, understand it, and then project what was going to happen next and plan your next move. And that's a constant loop. That's a mental model, constant loop that people are going through. And we talked a lot about that perception element in that episode. And in this one, I kind of want to talk about how we think about how we comprehend and project what's going to happen. So there's a lot of mistakes that can get made because we misinterpret information. And a lot of ways that we misinterpret is based on our biases, our knowledge base, and how we perceive information. Now, psychology and human performance research has done a lot to look at different types of biases and how they affect us. And I think we should cover a couple of those different biases and maybe talk about how those things lead to errors.
Awesome.
Does that sound like where we want to go?
Yeah, it does, because, and I love this segue. I mean, it doesn't just apply to the example of, what we talked about, human error, in that context of the previous episode, but it's a good way to jumping off point. It's a good place to start, because these same biases impact other areas of work or our life. But yeah, like give us an example of one of the most common ones that research has uncovered, or that you folks have done in your discovered in your work.
So I think the most common one that people talk about is confirmation bias. That's the first. It's probably the most common that people discuss. And essentially, confirmation bias is looking for information that's consistent with your beliefs. It's ignoring information that doesn't match with what your current belief system is. So when we think about human error, when we think about people working in an environment, things for confirmation bias might be, we believe that when we do this, it's always going to produce this result. And, or that, it might be, from a kind of a safety or maybe a safety perspective, we believe that this type of action by us will drive these results. Mm-hmm. And when we see that action bear fruit, we immediately go, of course it did. That's exactly what my beliefs are. And so we might be doing something that is detrimental to our organization or to a process, but we only catalog when it works right. We don't catalog when it goes bad.
Yeah.
So a common...
Yeah, no, go ahead. I think you were going to get into maybe an example.
Yeah. So a common like non-safety example would be, when you have the fortune teller, right? There's the fortune teller they get a hit, right? And so if you believe that fortune tellers can see the future, you'll remember their hits when they got the right answer, and you're going to forget all the times that they were wrong. And so that's a pretty clear example of confirmation bias. The belief that somebody is right, or is consistently right, you're going to ignore those misses from them.
So I'm going to beat up on my favorite topic that I use for many different examples of this type of stuff, and that is our good friend the red tag system in a manufacturing environment. Is okay, we created a process or a policy or a procedure, and on paper it makes sense. We expect this result. It should produce this result if you follow the procedure. When it doesn't bear fruit, right? When it doesn't produce the results that we hoped it would produce, because on paper, then we immediately go, oh, because you didn't you didn't follow this procedure. And so that must be what happened. So all of our energy and effort is around fixing the person. Why didn't you follow this procedure? Like, because we know if you follow a procedure, that piece of equipment or that tool or that material wouldn't have defective material or equipment would not have been used. But we ignore all the other things. There are no red tags. We don't know where they're located. We got to walk halfway across the facility to get one, and we're right in the middle of running product or production, and so we ignore all those things, and we just kind of use our process as a proxy, if you will, right? Which could be another bias. And is that an example of like I'm going to actually seek out? I'm like, did you follow? That's the first question out of my mouth, as a matter of fact. Did you follow the red tag? Well, no. Well, I'm done. That's the easiest investigation I've ever done.
So it definitely could show up in an example similar to that. If you looked at an example from kind of history, the Challenger incident.
Right.
If you look at who was on the investigation team, the original one, one of the guys, the human performance people that they had, his background was in fatigue, was in looking for, and studying fatigue and its effect on decision making and performance. And so he had a hammer and he was looking for a nail, right?
Nail, right.
And so in an investigation, you could have a belief, you could have an instruction, and you may miss all these other avenues to look at. And that could be a portion of this. Another way that you see this also in operational performance. Mm-hmm. So you could have a belief about a person. Joe, he's an excellent worker. He gets things done. He's fast and efficient. And Tom over here, Tom is my bad apple. He makes mistakes all the time and causes nothing but problems.
Yep.
And when you have those biases, this is a simple biases towards a person. Well, with Joe over here, who you think is your top performer, you're going to ignore the mistakes. You're going to ignore the signs of nonconformance or when they're breaking procedures and breaking processes to get the result. So they're breaking the rules to get the good result. You're going to ignore those, and you're going to focus on Tom over here, and you're going to notice every time he makes a mistake, whether it results in a bad outcome or not, you're going to be monitoring and thinking about that. So you kind of have a bias that makes you think this person is worse than they are, and this person is better than they are, just because of your perception of that individual. So that's another example of confirmation bias.
Wow, that's good stuff. It's interesting you bring up just like professional acumen, professional background and experience. Yeah, if you've got somebody who specializes in one area of discipline and that's all they focus on and seek out and study and look at, then it makes sense. It's not a guarantee, right? But you could skew that way. You could be looking for that particular thing to confirm your beliefs. Well, that just tells us it's all that more important to have a diverse deep dive team or learning team or whatever you want to call it nowadays, right? Have different sets of eyes to catch that stuff. Is that fair?
Yeah, so that certainly helps. Challenging biases in the nuclear industry, they have a term they call validating assumptions.
Yeah.
And so you want to almost assign somebody in those teams to be a person that's validating assumptions. And so they check these biases, these different ones we talk about, and you can kind of compare it against this list and say, hey, are we just using confirmation and we have a belief system and we're just looking for data that confirms it? Mm-hmm. You have a person that's looking for that too. Now, there's a similar, you'll laugh at this once I say it, there's a similar type of bias to confirmation, and it's called similarity bias.
There's a similar one called
yeah. So we got similarity bias, and that one is trusting ideas that are similar to your own or the way that you do things. And so if something is similar to the way you do it or similar to the beliefs that you have, you're going to be more likely to trust it and less likely to validate if it's true or false.
So it isn't so much this confirms my belief system. It moves more to close enough, right?
Well,
It's similar to.
Yeah. So if I have a belief system like, let's state it from like an operator perspective or a human performance perspective, that, night shift always makes mistakes, or night shifts, are generally the people that make mistakes. So that would be a belief, right? We've got a belief. And, you would then believe something similar to that, which would be, something that's if we, and I'm trying to create one off of the night shift thing, but if you've got something like night shift makes mistakes, if I bring somebody to night shift, maybe they're going to make more mistakes. And that's going to be, it's similar because I've got all these guys that are at work night shift that make mistakes, and I'm making it where it's the people and not the time period.
Right.
And so you can blend those things and trust that the ideas are similar, and that's going to make you more likely to accept something. And those are the kind of things that you're looking for with biases to check. You're looking to say, is this something that's similar to what I believe, and therefore I'm not cognitively checking it and pushing back on an idea. One of a more maybe political nature would be if you believe that, one institution or one, maybe we'll keep it out of the political, keep it in organizational. Maybe you believe that, one group in the office, maybe the engineering group or the safety group or the quality group, you believe that group is not helpful, then you might take that same belief and say, if the quality group here is bad, then the engineering group is probably also bad because they're also sitting in the offices.
Right.
So that's, again, you're looking for it's similar. It's not the same, but it's similar. And therefore your belief is kind of more likely to believe that all quality people are the same, or all safety guys are the same, right?
Yeah. And the end result being it shades your view of an incident. Clouds your objectivity, your judgment.
Yeah, and this shows up a lot when it's when you think of like operating equipment.
Yeah.
So you might have a fork truck that you drive, and you're really good at operating it. And this lever goes forward, this lever does the forks, and you get to a similar fork truck, and it's close enough. I'm experienced. I don't really need to get extra training on it. I can hop on this thing and drive.
Right.
And I'll be fine. I know how fork trucks work. And so you can believe that, hey, these things are similar, and I'm confident enough in my skills with this one fork truck that I can drive this other one.
Right.
And
so it sounds a little like, and I could be way off on this and this is great because we could talk about all this stuff all day, but it sounds a little like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you get a little bit of knowledge in something, but your confidence goes way up. You actually you're a little overconfident, and you apply it to areas you should not apply it to, maybe because you think they're the same. You think they're similar enough that it's like, oh, well, I know how to do this one. I could pretty much jump on any piece of equipment around here and run it. And that may not be the case.
It's very similar, and it's probably the same, thing in our brains that makes us, overestimate our abilities, is probably very similar to the part that makes us trust in what we think we know.
Yeah.
And trust in ideas that are similar enough to them. It's probably a very similar part of our human psychology that does that.
Yeah, I was talking to Drew Hinton on a previous episode recent. I think the one just before this, couple before this one, by the time this one goes out, about this same type of issue, the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I think that's where we we coined the phrase, trust me, I'm a safety professional. And we had one of our members made a little t-shirt graphic of that because we sometimes attribute some of these qualities to people based on what we think about their past performance or their profession. We just sort of put blind trust in, oh, well, if Blaine says that, it must be true. And we don't validate it. It could have been an assumption I made, like you said. And I know I asked you about a knot chart, and I know it's a crude, and this is the way I see it. So you could correct me if I'm way off on this, but I'm a fan of like anything that will help us, flush some of that out. Like, okay, write that down, that thing you think contributed or whatever to this incident or this defect or whatever we're talking about, and then put it in a category. Do we know that? How do we know that? How did we validate that? Is this an opinion, right? That we something we do not know, it's not known, or so that knot chart, KNOT, like there's categories that you put stuff in, need to know, something we know, need to know, opinion. What was the T? Trying to remember now off the top of my head.
You blanked me too.
Yeah, I know. But I like those types of tools because it forces you, if you're honest about the process anyway, most people would do it. It forces you to see it visually. You wrote it down, you put it on a board, you put it on paper, or you're talking to somebody. Forces you to put it in a category to ask almost that counter question of, are you sure? How do you know this? Where did you see it? Did you validate it? Can somebody else pick up on this? And so I'm a real fan of those types of tools. And I know I'm jumping ahead on how do we combat biases, but like you talked about errors and mistakes. I keep going, my head keeps going back to incident investigations. The forklift, I think, is a good example of how a bias could lead me to make a mistake that I would then somebody else would then be investigating, right? Like, well, you're a trained forklift operator. Why did you mess up on this one? And that could have been a contributing factor, right? That similarity bias.
Mm-hmm.
So are there other examples that you use that you come across of like how people make mistakes or increases the opportunity for errors and mistakes, some of these different biases?
Yeah. So when we think about these biases, what we want to think about is, we have a person in a specific situation, and the information that they're getting and the decisions that they make are sometimes wholly unique. And you have to take time to understand that moment in time where they're at. Now, the way we approach it with TapRooT, we build out a snap chart, the timeline of what happened, and we look at each action. And under that action, you might pull over this information. So when you're looking at these biases, when you're looking at this mistake that someone made, you have to really look at the context of that decision. And what information did they have? What knowledge did they have at the time? And how did they go about making that decision? Now, there's a lot of things that we can do to improve someone's decision-making ability. And so a lot of times people go, with hindsight bias, right? The 2020.
That's another bias. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another one. We can see the back. We can see the obvious path they should have taken.
Right. Because we know the outcome. Because we have benefit of the outcome.
Oh, it was obvious that they shouldn't have done this. Well, you've got to take it in context of what they knew at the time. So you might have a thing where, if they had just followed the procedure, right? We all say that phrase.
Yeah.
If they had just followed the procedure, everything would have worked out fine. Yeah, well, at the time, that procedure is located in a file cabinet in the other side of the building. They don't have it with them. They never carry it with them. That's not part of their process. No one requires it. We don't audit it. Well, of course they weren't using the procedure. So you've got a document in a file cabinet somewhere that tells them how to do the job, but they don't have it with them. So of course they're not going to follow it because it doesn't exist with them. And of course they're going to do this from memory because that's the way they were trained.
Yeah, yeah.
And so those kind of things, looking at the context of it, you might see why somebody made the mistake that they did. And then looking at the context, you go, oh, well, yeah, of course we had this helpful document, but it wasn't there. It wasn't with them. They weren't using it. It wasn't expected that they kept it with them. So that's the kind of thing that we can realize when we're looking at the context and these biases. You know, the way we give people information has to be in such a way that they can make appropriate decisions. And so understanding these biases can help us kind of understand how we need to give information to people, and maybe the ways that we should make information easier to interpret or clearer to interpret. Mm-hmm. Because if we give people too much information that's too vague, well, what you're doing is you're increasing the complexity of the decision they have to make. And so that's what you don't want, is to be giving people really complex decisions to make, because that has really, they make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
By having that complex decision.
I see this with infrequent tasks or process paths that you're technically cross-trained in, but yet when you start working, let's say you take a new hire and you have this bank of topics that you have to train them on. And I'm talking through their orientation, everything from how to clock in, how to request time off, to how to log into your computer or these different devices you have to use, and start machines and operate different machines, and the safety orientation. You dump them. It could be one full day. It could be a 5-day orientation. And then maybe we make the extra effort. We throw some job shadowing in there, and they partner with somebody. And so that's where we start to introduce variation, right? Because somebody's going to have their own little way of doing stuff, because it's natural to experiment, as you've discussed on a previous episode. And it gets into our deviation conversation. But you're right. And now I'm working in a process path for a month, and I've been trained on 2 others. And then supervisor comes to me and says, hey, Blaine, we really need you to help out over here on this line. I show that you've been trained on that. Can you go over there? How likely is it that I'm going to recall all of the steps in those processes involved in that process I have to work on? Or there's no like refresher there. I just jump in and I look and I just try to keep up. Most people aren't going to say anything. Most people are going to want to try to do a good job and not look stupid, right? Is that an example that kind of fits into that like combination of various things you just said?
Yeah. So what you just described, we would call in the human performance industry, we'd call it an error trap.
Error trap. Yep.
Or a precursor. And essentially what error trap and precursor is you're putting someone in a situation, or you're going into a situation where you are likely to make an error.
Yeah. Our process, by how we go about doing that, increase the chance of them making a mistake.
Well, just the situation that you're in.
Yeah.
So, for an example, there's a list. There's a huge list. So we might touch a couple today.
Okay.
But one of those would be performing a task that you're unfamiliar with.
Familiar with, yeah.
Or a task that you haven't done it, you're inexperienced, or you haven't done it in a while, right? Those would be 2 examples of something where you're likely to make a mistake.
Right.
Now, the response, when you recognize you're putting someone in an error likely situation, the response from the person and from the supervisor should be, okay, I recognize I'm in an error likely situation. Let's add in some additional tool or safeguard to protect us, to reduce the likelihood.
Yeah.
Now, I'll state this: the effectiveness of recognizing when you're in an area likely situation is actually very low.
Yeah.
So people are really bad at recognizing when they're in a situation. However, I think it is important to understand error traps, because especially as supervisors, we need to be looking for when we're putting people in error likely situations to add additional safeguards. So if I'm going to be pulling over a person and putting them in a role that they're unfamiliar with, right? I've got somebody called off, I'm shorthanded, and I've got something critical that's got to get done. It has to get done on this shift. Well, okay, I'm going to pull this newbie and I'm going to put them in their unfamiliar task. Well, what additional things can I do? I can check up on them frequently. I can have them do second checks where they have people come and check behind them. And yes, it's going to slow down my process, but I need to slow it down because I have someone in an error likely situation. So I need to slow it down a little bit.
Yeah.
I should not expect that I'm going to be running at rate in this, and I shouldn't put that pressure, because if I put the pressure on this person, now I'm adding an additional error trap of being in a hurry and feeling pressured. So they're now going to be overloaded, and they're going to be at the extent of their knowledge and capacity, again, making them more likely to make a mistake.
Yeah, it compounds the issue, right? It's one of those examples. So what's funny, you mentioned something that was interesting, and that is that, there are lots of reasons why we may not recognize that we're in a high risk situation, or that we are putting somebody in a high risk situation. And it could be any of those other biases we were talking about. We have a good training program and we have good processes. They were trained. How hard is it? It's like, technically, if you think about it, that's a bias. Excuse me.
Yep.
That's a bias. So, you're reminding me of so many things. One, there's another approach to that you can use to check some of this, and you call it the substitution test. You could go do an observation how other people do it. Like if you're dead set on, if you just follow the procedure, this wouldn't have happened. How do others do it, right? Would somebody else in the same situation with similar experience, have done it this way as well? And more often than not, I've found, and it might be a bias of mine, I'll admit, more often than not, they would probably have done it in a similar way, or their own way of doing it, which is still variance, right? So it's really hard to put it on the individual. You were trained, you knew the process, it's written down. What's wrong with you? And it moves it from that to, okay, the process we follow to put people cross-train, put people in different process paths at some point in the future. We expect the same rate. We don't change the expectation, right? And we don't adjust that safeguard. Do you think people struggle with that? Like because we still see human error written up all the time. We did a whole episode on it, but is it because of all this other stuff that people can't get out of their own way and they can't see or don't know what they don't know? Maybe we just need to do a better job, like people like us in our industries, educating people and just talking more about this?
So we need to make sure that as safety professionals, we are taking a systems approach to looking at our processes. And what that means is we need to see if we're setting people up for success or failure. So essentially, is my management system aligned to make sure that people are following rules? Am I giving people the tools and techniques and processes there to make them know what the right answer is? And am I making it easy to do right, hard to do wrong?
Yeah, you've talked about that so many times in the past.
It's my favorite line. It's my favorite line. Easy to do right, hard to do wrong. And so you've got to set them up. And when we think about people, you're exactly right. I could have two people that are both, they're different individuals. They have different levels of experience, and I can put them into a system and they can still both make the bad outcome occur. And so I've got to understand what's missing in my system to really get a picture of that. And so this is where, again, taking this back to the topic we're talking about, we have to understand the context in which people are making decisions. Now, there's some other kind of biases that affect our ability. And one of them is frequency and availability bias. These are two different biases, but they sort of have the same problem. So a frequency bias is after you notice something for the first time, you're going to start noticing it more. And you think that means that it has a higher frequency of occurrence.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's just that you're paying attention to it more. So it might be something like, I'll give the generic example and then the safety specific one. The generic example would be maybe you bought a new car.
I was going to say, you're going to use the automobile example.
Exactly,
this is
right?
a good one. Yeah.
You buy a new car and suddenly you see that car all over the place.
Yeah.
Now, is that because everyone else is buying that car? Oh, what a smart decision I've made. Clearly everybody's got the right idea.
Yeah.
Or is it just that you're looking for and you've been primed for that? So, not a humble brag here, but I bought in 2020, I bought one of the first Model Ys in Knoxville, Tesla Model Y. And I started noticing Teslas everywhere. Now, it started off small, like I noticed one or two, and then suddenly I noticed a bunch more. Now, that could be frequency bias, where maybe at the early on, I'm just noticing more Teslas because I'm driving one. Or it could be real because so many more Teslas had been purchased in Tennessee and in Knoxville at the time that the number of vehicles being driven, number of Teslas being driven was increasing. And so you've got to confirm, is that a frequency bias that it's just because you've noticed it, or is the actual number going up? And so when we think of like safety example, you might have hand injuries. And you may get, let's say you've done some sort of campaign recently about hand injuries, and you get a spike in reporting. Now you have to decide, is that spike because you've primed them to think about hand injuries?
Right.
And they're just finding all of the ones that were being covered up before, or they weren't noticing?
Yeah.
Or is it an actual increase due to some process change, some new variable that we didn't take into account, or something like that? And so as safety professionals, we have to take this one into account, certainly when we do our rollouts, because one of the things you're going to notice is it's going to spike and then it may stay down low. Yeah. Oh, we fixed the problem. Our problems have gone away. Well, no, we just had a frequency spike because we brought it up, and then they stopped thinking about it. Therefore, it went down, and we haven't fixed anything in our process really in that spike.
So in my work, in my past life with the Voluntary Protection Program, the partnership with OSHA, helping a lot of companies go through this, I actually did a presentation at the Department of Labor, years ago. Falk was the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Director of OSHA at the time. And I did a presentation to OSHA about this because, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but, to participate in the VPP and to submit your application, there's some requirements that OSHA has. And that is your 3-year total case incident rate and DART rate has to be at or below the industry average for at least 1 out of those 3 years. At the time, this was the standard. And so the problem companies were experiencing when they made the decision, a conscious decision to, like, we want to improve our safety management system. We're not happy with where it's at. This is a good benchmark target to hit. It's going to help us across the board. Or we feel we have a really good one. We should get recognition for it. And they start doing this work, some of the fine tuning to get ready to submit to VPP. They saw exactly what you're saying. One of the requirements was that you have to have a mechanism in place for employees to report safety concerns, hazards, and can be anonymous if they choose to be. And so a lot of companies didn't really have a good program for that. And so they started rolling out this effort of like, hey, this is a new tool we have to report concerns. We're going to focus on the process and not the people. And, you can remain anonymous. We just want to help solve problems. Well, then they would get a flood of stuff. And they're like, what's going on? And I'm like, oh, no, that was always there. Right? It was always there. You're just now increasing, you now have said to them, sent the signal, we want to now hear, we want you to communicate it to us. And so you get this spike. We called it the VPP spike. Near misses and first aids they're like, wait a minute, how are we going to submit our application to VPP? We're getting this flood of injury reports. And I'm like, I'm telling you, they were always happening. But for one reason or another, they thought the company didn't care. They thought that there wasn't time, that they thought they were minor incidents and that you didn't care about them or whatever. But now all of a sudden you sent the signal, which is good, right? Well, now we know, and we can like build, you can deep dive it, and we can build a better, improve our processes to combat that. But it's funny that you say that, because we did a whole presentation on this, but we didn't know what it was at the time. We called it the VPP spike, but that's what it is, right? It's exactly what you described.
Yeah. So, and again, the biggest challenge that you have when you're in that situation is really sorting through, what is the stuff you actually care about in this pile,
right?
And what you have effect on. And so it's going to spike and then it will go down. The question is it going down because you fixed something, or is it going down because people are less primed? And that's what you have as from a data standpoint, have to really understand is, what is the measure? So one of the things that, again, and we talked a little bit about it when we did the leadership episode a little bit ago, but you've got to set the right standard and know what is the right action that you're driving. If you're just driving and making your decisions based on reporting numbers, well, you're going to get a lot of reports, but are they valuable, and are you doing something about them? So figuring out how you're responding to those metrics is an important thing. And availability bias can time into this. And availability bias is essentially, it's a human tendency to think that examples of things that come readily to mind are representative of the population. So again, I go back to the driving example. There's the cliche, right, that women are worse drivers than men, right? That's an example, and you might be able to think of, I could think of the ex-girlfriend that wrecked the car, or your the old woman that's driving slow and causing traffic problems and things. And you might have something that you have as a tendency, a bias in your mind, and it may not represent the true facts. If you looked at the data, insurance companies do.
Right. I was going to say, I know my son's insurance is way higher than my daughter's.
Exactly. So yeah. So it certainly isn't true that at a young age, up till about 25, men are way worse drivers than women. Right. And that's because they take stupid risks and they drive like maniacs. But somewhere along the line, and I know it when I was 25, I got married when I was 25 as well. And so I got like a double cut to my insurance. My insurance like reduced to a third of what it was, because I got married and I turned 25. And they're like, oh, he's safe and responsible now. Yeah. 1 year difference. But that's the difference, that, by 25, your brain is developed and is better at reducing the risk decisions that it takes. May not be perfect.
Of course, they're looking actuarially, right? They're looking at large data sets, so they could see these trends. There are exceptions, individual exceptions to everything, of course. That's a great example, and that's it's a true bias. It's also, people call it a stereotype.
Yep.
But we attribute most often incorrectly attribute actions, behaviors, or patterns to individuals based on background, education, tenure on the job, things like that. We also see this. I see this with my safety colleagues. They do this a lot. Oh, you're more likely to sustain an incident or injury in the first 6 to 12 months of employment. So because of that, we're going to keep reminding you. We're going to do little refresher trainings and keep reminding you. And you're like, that's training is the answer. It's, how do you know that the reason why you have a high frequency of incident rates among that demographic, somebody from 0 to 12 months of tenure, how do you know it's because they don't remember how to do something? And it isn't because we have complex processes, or that we're labor sharing them to another process and that they haven't worked at since they got hired, and they're month 3 in, and they've got it's like day 1 now all of a sudden for them, or day 0 in most cases. So that's another one I see a lot of. They'll say, oh, we've got to get in front of these people more often and tell them, remember the procedures, remember your gloves, remember. And it's like, that's probably not what's causing, or it may be, I don't know, but show me the data. Prove it.
So I find this really interesting. We had, there's the U shape of accidents, and it's not every company that gets this U shape, but a lot of them do. You have the really experienced and the really inexperienced that get injured.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I believe is definitely the case with the new people is the methods that we employ to train people are not the methods that people need in order to make complex decisions. So if you're going to train somebody with PowerPoint slide or touch point even training of, I'm going to come up and remind them, that training is almost useless when it comes to actual situational decision making. So what I mean by this, if I am in a crisis, if I am in an emergency, I am not going to remember the PowerPoint slide from the fire guy that told me how to exit appropriately. I'm not going to remember a single part of that presentation. I'm going to roughly remember the direction I needed to head in, probably. And so what we have to do instead of, the PowerPoint reminder training is we have to do simulations. So the example of a fire drill is a perfect example of this. We don't want to wait until a fire for somebody to know where they need to exit at. Yep. And we know that just explaining it in a PowerPoint is not good enough. So what do? We do a fire drill. We simulate it in a safe way so that everybody can exit and make sure that they know the process and everybody runs through it. That's a simulation. And so when that fire actually occurs, people know what to do. And we ought to take that approach with other aspects of training is go, okay, what are the actual error likely situations that new people are going to come into? Where are they going to come into uncertainty in their new, positions? And how can we simulate that uncertainty in a safe way so that we can show them the right responses?
Yeah. Do you see this with job rotation as well? I mean, it increases risk. There's a whole body of evidence out there. I kind of lean into this one where, and there's a lot of evidence too, by the way, that job rotations actually increase incident rates, increase risk. And for this reason, you get somebody in a rhythm and they're used to doing this, they're familiar with it. And then all of a sudden, maybe it's a couple of days later, maybe it's during that same shift, we rotate them. Now they've got to ramp up and, to a whole new process. And it can increase the error rate, if that makes sense. Have you seen like any data on that as well?
Yeah. So that's another one of those error traps. So the idea is that anytime somebody is assuming control or assuming information and I say assume as in taking over,
right? Taking
over a new system, a new task, that is putting an opportunity, because you have opportunities for communication errors, you have opportunities for them, like you said, they're getting into that warm-up phase. And so again, thinking how you do that turnover process, if you're going to rotate people out, well, you need to rotate people out of certain jobs.
Yeah.
Think of a lifeguard. You can't have a lifeguard sitting on the same bench the whole time. They get bored. Their vigilance decreases. So you've got to rotate them into new zones. But how you handle that rotation into a new area, into a new task, is important, because if I stay too long in a task, well, now I've gone into autopilot mode and I'm not paying attention. So we need to rotate people out. But when we rotate them in, how do we give them the proper information? How do we put them in whatever that ramp up state needs to be to make sure that we're not overloading them immediately? I think of it like it's the, and I'm trying to remember who the famous, she worked at she did a chocolate factory scene.
Lucille Ball.
Yeah, Lucille Ball.
Lucy.
And Lucy going in there, and you just see her coming in and she's just, I'm behind. Oh my goodness. And that's such a great little scene of thinking about if you had brought somebody in at the top speed there was no hope that they would even survive. Even that
Right.
ramp up that she had was probably too fast for her.
Yeah.
But it's such
Now,
a
you
great
just made
little,
me date myself, by the way. You made
I
me.
know that I knew the clip. I couldn't think the Lucille Ball at the time.
It was
But
a good one. There's
it's such
also
a
one
good,
of them crushing the grapes, a good scene of them doing that process and famously messing that one up.
yep, yep. And so those are things that you've got to take into account when you're bringing somebody in. What is that process? What is that ramp? And how do you make sure we're setting people up for success, right? To tie that back
Yeah.
to that.
So another good example that you made me think of about job rotation, which it is needed in a lot of tasks, a lot of areas, heat related areas like confined space. You don't want somebody, on their back in a vessel, a horizontal space welding for too long. You want to, rotate somebody else in there, but you have to expect that the person going in has to get situated, has to assess, where the work stopped, right? And it's got to stop at a logical spot, at a seam, or if you're welding or cutting or whatever. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. You don't just say, "Oh, time's up, Blaine, come on out," and another one comes in and go. My fire background, right? We had to rotate in and out of structures. We weren't allowed to stay in for too long, for obvious reasons. But that transition period, that slows the process down, and that's where you really have to pay attention, especially in a life-saving or emergent scenario. That we took that transition period very seriously, because we know that's where mistakes happen. That's where you have to ease into it. You don't just go running into a fire. There was a process by which we drilled and practiced for that, and that made sense. And so no, you can't treat every job or task like that, but having that same approach of, okay, where is our risk when transitioning from one task or process to another? How do we, as you said earlier, build safeguards into that, like increase touch points with them, have second checks, all that good stuff. So would you recommend, is that something like you guys would recommend to people to add to take a look at, like what safeguards do you have in place, or do you just rotate people and they start working?
No, so we talk in our process in the TapRooT root cause tree. There's actually 3 places, maybe 4, that we talk about turning over information and assuming, from your rotation. So one of them is when we talk about communication. So you've got to communicate information correctly. The other is talking about when you should rotate. So it's under human engineering, there's monitoring alertness, and how frequently should you rotate. We talk about that as well. The last thing is that knowledge-based decision.
Yeah.
And when you're having to make a knowledge-based decision, how do you give people information? How do you give people the right knowledge and things presented in the right way to make the right decision? There's a way of thinking about this from like an information standpoint as we give people information. If your system is really complex, you really want to reduce and simplify as much as possible. And if you can't proceduralize something, if you can't make it step 1, 2, and 3, they're going to have to make a complex system. Then what you have to do is you have to make that information really clear, and it has to be given to them in a way that they can make that decision quickly.
Yeah.
So you have to make that really transparent for the type of information and what's happening.
You're really relying on their expertise and decision-making process in those moments there. So you have to invest heavily in that person if you're transitioning from simplifying processes and controls and flattening that out to, okay, now we have to really make really good people, right?
Well, and not just the person, you have to invest in the information technology. So an example would be a fighter pilot, right? Yep. They have to make snap-second decisions and they are using a lot of their knowledge in figuring out what is the right decision to make. Well, what has the Air Force done? They've done so much work on how they present data,
the
method,
visors versus the old HUD system, right?
So that method, as
Yep.
well as the ways, what's the most important information that you need at any one time?
Yeah.
Well, how do I make that as readily available and as easy to detect? So again, back to that situational awareness mental model, I have to make it easy to perceive and easy to comprehend what's important.
Yeah.
So the way and the manner that you present data and information can affect decision making. This is probably the last bias we'll talk about, but it's called framing bias. The way I frame that information and data can affect decision making. Now, we see this the most commonly in news media. So, pick any two political news organizations. We won't have to say which ones, but you could take any topic and you could go to the two opposite sides and they'll have the same topic. And the words in which they use frame your opinion of something.
Yeah.
So it could be, let's say it was an oil spill. That's a bad outcome. Nobody wants that in any industry, but you have an oil industry. So you might have one side would say toxic oil floods Gulf, destroying thousands of, whatever. So they've framed it's horrifying.
Yeah.
And then you could have another side that says minor release contained in Gulf of Mexico, right? Those are very two different headlines that are giving you and making you frame up to a different perception of the scale and the industry. Now, neither of those may be factual, right? It might have been minor, it might have been major, it could have been somewhere in between, but the way it's framed. So when we think about how we give information to people, the way we frame that information for what's most important can make a difference. So when we think of from like a management system section, a lot of manufacturing industries have some sort of Kanban, some sort of Andon, some sort of Obeya room. I'm just throwing out a bunch of Japanese words. I always love to do it. But you've got an information board. You've got information. Well, what's most important? What decision do I need to make? And can I make it visual? Can I make it, easy to detect what's wrong, easy to detect what's going right, and be able to make my decision, right? It's you make a decision at a glance.
Yeah.
You could see a problem at a glance. And so the way we frame things, we should be able to give information. So if I've got somebody coming into a line, what's the information they need to know first? And how do I present that to quickly get them up to speed and get them the information they need to understand where they're at and what they need to do? So those are the kind of things that we think about. And when we see the error likely situations, we can then set up our safeguards to reduce those error likely situations. So again, I'm thinking of, okay, we've got a new person coming in. All right, we'll just tie it back to that front one. We've got somebody that's inexperienced tying into this. Okay, I need to make sure that I'm giving them the most important information that's going to set them up for success. And what is that for this person's experience level? Well, I need to know what their experience is. I need to have a really good understanding of what they know and don't know. And I need to be able to validate all my biases and check all my biases before I set them up for failure. And so that's the kind of thing that we have to kind of keep in mind as we're going through these is taking what we know, looking and adapting to the situation that we're in, and recognizing what additional safeguards we've got to put in place.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, and we talked about this before. I think I may have asked you about this. One of the most popular questions I get is, hey, how long is this? We'll use root cause analysis. How long is this training? Can you cut that in half? And it's like, or can you just send some slide decks? Like, do you have something that like we're going to teach our managers about deep dives in our 15-minute call? Do you have something? I'm like, what results are you expecting out of this? Like, what are you expecting them to be able to do as a result of the information you're going to present to them? Because you've got a couple of slides you're going to cover. Don't expect a whole lot. Like this, if it were this easy, we wouldn't be having these problems in society, in business, right? In industries. This stuff it can get complex, but that's why I love talking to you, because you use so many good examples and you break it down succinctly, and it makes sense. But this is why we have to continue these conversations and get this information in front of the right people, the operations managers and leaders, and the workers, certainly safety professionals, because that's my bias. But yeah, this is really good stuff. I love that we're continuing these types of conversations on this era. You're my go-to, by the way, you know this by now, is your fifth. I don't remember now. Well, the first one I interviewed your dad, so we can include that in the.
Yeah. That'd be 5 then.
There you go. So yeah, this is really, really good stuff. Obviously, anybody that wants to learn more about TapRooT can go to.
So there's 2 options. If you want to think more about this human performance element, you'd want to come to our Stopping Human Error course. The next one's going to be in the last week of April at our TapRooT Summit. It's our pre-summit courses. It's a 2-day course. We cover cognitive biases. We cover error traps. We go into detail on the more effective things, because like I said, we're not very good at recognizing when we're in these situations, but how do we get us to a higher level of human performance? They could go to that if they want to hear about that. If they want to look at the human performance element and look at applying it to investigations, come to a 5-day. I've already met several listeners that have come to my 5 days from this.
Nice.
And I'm always happy to chat with them. People always seem to find these conversations interesting. I know most of them, right? We're probably driving to a location, driving to a site, driving home,
and listening. Yeah,
and listening. That's often the case. But that would be the other places. Come to one of our public courses that we have. It's a great way to talk about looking at the system and not the people, going beyond that just that simple mistake and really learning the context behind it. Our process is built for that, and that's what we want people to do is to get beyond just looking at the human error. Start thinking about the context, what's driving that decision making.
Yeah, and what I always tell the uninitiated, those that are asking for like, what do I do? Where do I start? After an incident occurs, there's no time to put them in a 5-day. The incident happened. We've got to unpack this. Once you identify, drift, deviation, or an error trap, that's where you start digging. You've got to do some stuff to, once you're like, I think I'm onto it. All this stuff we just talked about comes into play. Validate that. Is it an assumption? Is it an opinion? How are others viewing it? It's really easy to get others involved to take a look at something and then start digging deeper into that, push past human error. Blaming workers for mistakes is like blaming water for being wet. And there's even controversy about water's not wet. Have you seen this one? That's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. But I think you get my point.
I love that one. The water's not wet. You're like, oh, you're just killing me.
Yes, absolutely killing me. The sky's not technically blue. It's like, okay, but you know what I mean. All right. Awesome. Hey, thanks, Alex. I hope everyone in the household is on the mend and that you are not on the decline in the next couple of days. So keep me posted. And we'll set up another one. We'll continue. I think, did we decide what we wanted to roll into next after this? We talked about a lot.
We could spend more time on the error traps. We could spend more time on some other topics around human
error
performance.
traps. Yeah. We might go into error traps because we covered normalization of deviation. That was a great. I get really good response on that topic. That's a popular topic. So like error traps would be good in digging really deep into that on our next one. We'll make that happen.
There you have it. Another topic broken down for us by Alex Paradies from TapRooT. Go to taproot.com. Check out all the stuff that they're doing over there, the courses and training programs they offer for your organization. You're not going to be disappointed, and more organizations certainly need it. No affiliation with TapRooT at the time of this recording. Just some cool folks doing some cool stuff. and I love bringing it to you. So go ahead and check them out. As always, be sure to support our partners in safety. Be sure to show them some love as well. That's mightylinetape.com/podcast. And of course, aerosafetyus.com. Be sure to mention us at Aero Safety. Get 25% off your first estimate for all their services. And if you want to see the full recorded video of my interview with Alex, head over to the Safety Pro Podcast community site. I've got a link in the show notes, so you can head over there and check that video out as well. And we will talk to you on the next Safety Pro Podcast.